Hello, my name is Danielle Roberts, and I'm here to tell you about how two men under-promised and over-delivered their way into changing the study of science with artistry. Picture this. It's the mid-1800s. Public museums are springing up all around you like mushrooms. Philip Henry Goss is scraping every sea creature off the bottom of the ocean floor and illustrating them. Charles Darwin is writing about evolutionary theory. The general public has come down with a fever known as pterodomania. And in the midst of all of this, George Lincoln Goodale is appointed as the second botany professor of Harvard and is charged with creating a botanical museum that will not only educate the students of Harvard, but will dazzle the general public. But the specimens he has at his disposal aren't that compelling because they are pressed flat and have lost all of their shape and color. The alternative paper mache and wax flowers would deteriorate with time and handling, and the plants in the greenhouses have their own restrictive seasons of blooming and growing conditions. Goodale's college in the zoology department, Louis Agassiz, has already started his museum, which included taxidermied specimens, ancient fossils, and a few very detailed sea creatures spun from glass. Like plants, sea creatures cannot easily be kept in museum conditions. When preserved in glass jars, they lose their color and shape very quickly. But if the fellows who made those glass sea creatures could make plant specimens, that just might solve Goodale's problem. And so in 1886, Professor Goodale embarks for Dresden to present his proposal to the artists. When he arrives, he meets Leopold and Rudolf Blaschke, a father and son glassworking team. The Blaschke family had been glassworkers since the 1500s. As a young man, the father Leopold apprenticed with a goldsmith and learned jewelry-making techniques that he applied to his craft. In the 1850s, 30 years before our story begins, Leopold's first wife, first son, and father all died in quick succession, and he sought consolation in the natural world. He decided to take a voyage to America. During his trip, the seas went calm, and the ship was stranded for a couple of weeks in the middle of the Atlantic. While stranded, Leopold spent his days collecting and sketching jellyfish. Like many people, he'd only ever seen drawings of these creatures, and he was enthralled with their glass-like transparency. Leopold was so fascinated that when he returned home, he expanded the family business beyond fancy goods to include the glass representations of sea creatures that he'd seen on his travels. Upon his return, Leopold found love again, and they had a son, Rudolf, in 1857. Rudolf shared his father's capacity for the delicate glasswork, and at the age of 13, joined him as an apprentice, which was fortunate because the glass sea creature business exploded with popularity as people filled their museums and aquariums alike. Leopold was a savvy businessman and partnered with zoological specimen suppliers who were connected both with the explorers for the source material and the curators for the output. Luckily for Professor Goodale, sea creatures weren't the only natural things the Blaschkes had worked on. In the early 1860s, Leopold had created glass floral arrangements as a hobby. This bouquet is one of the rare surviving specimens from that time. This was enough to convince Goodale that the Blaschkes were the right men to execute his vision. But the Blaschkes were hesitant. They had a thriving business. Why would they give that up? Professor Goodale prevailed on them to take at least a small commission. Goodale returned to the US, and the Blaschkes created their first set of flowers as a test. They delicately packaged them with tissue, straw, and padding to protect them from damage. Unfortunately, the people at customs were not as careful when reviewing the items and smashed them to smithereens. The remains were delivered to Harvard, and Professor Goodale was awed by their quality despite the damage sustained in transit. Now he just had to finance these wonders. So he reached out to a former student of his, Mary Ware, who was a great benefactress of the sciences and was, in many respects, a professional naturalist, who just so happened to be cursed with the terrible affliction of being a woman and therefore couldn't be counted as a man of science. Boo, patriarchy, yes, boo. Mary instantly recognized the Blaschkes' genius, and so they struck a deal for Rudolf and Leopold to work part-time for 3 years to create 50 botanical specimens for Harvard from their workshop in Dresden. Contract in hand, the Blaschkes began adding flowers to their work table. To produce the models, they used a glassworking technique known as lamp work, where the artist works on a table with a gas lamp rigged up to bellows that control the size of the flame. They created custom mixes of glass, pigment, and minerals, and placed rods of glass into the flame, and used tweezers and other tools to shape and refine the heated glass. As Leopold had learned in jewelry making, they worked in small batches and assembled the whole plants later from the tiny parts. They fashioned a copper wire armature and slid glass tubes over it to make the stem, and then applied leaves and petals one at a time. After assembling the glass plants, the Blashkas added texture, such as blowing fine cotton fibers on a leaf to mimic the woolly texture of mullein, dusting a flower with finely powdered pigment to represent pollen, using glue to mimic the fine veining on leaves, etching into pigment to create designs, or adding hundreds of tiny pieces of glass to make spores or cells. And the flowers aren't perfect, which is what makes them so uncanny. Because Rudolf and Leopold worked from life, they created models with wilting leaves and other abnormalities that someone trying to create a perfect scientific model might erase. The models document what is and not what should be. Many subjects were economically important plants with uses as food, medicine, or in other industrial capacities. Yeah, witch hazel. As you can see, they didn't just reproduce the life-size plant, they also made magnified models of its parts, such as the flowers, stamens, seeds, and cross-sections of the ovaries. The first models were so successful that in 1890, Merriwear funded a 10-year exclusive contract with the Blashkas to produce flowers full-time for Harvard. By this time, they had exhausted their supply of new plant specimens after visiting all the local gardens and greenhouses, working with samples sent from botanists around the world, and even maintaining their own private gardens. And so, it is time for a field trip. Rudolf set sail for America in February of 1892. When Rudolf arrived, he met with Professor Goodale and went to the Harvard Museum, where he saw for the first time the hundreds of pieces he and his father had created since they started working with Harvard 6 years before. In a letter to his father, he said, "With delight and emotion, I saw all the old friends united here, and I can report to you with joy that everything, even the oldest things, are still nice in form and color like we delivered them. My only regret while seeing the models is that you were not present to share my joy." While arrangements for his travels were made, Rudolf sketched local specimens, fixed some of the flowers that were broken in transit, and met his benefactress. Finally, he set off with Robert Cameron, the head gardener of the Harvard Botanical Society. They board a banana ship headed to their first stop, Jamaica. And when they arrive in Port Antonio and begin to explore all the vegetation Jamaica has to offer, Rudolf had only seen some of these species in greenhouses, and they were dwarfish compared to their wild counterparts. He even tries bananas for the first time, and this is, in fact, a glass banana that you see behind me. In fact, everything you see from here on out, glass. And he writes a rigorously scientific review of them in a letter to his parents. In fact, Rudolf is in constant contact with his parents, sending them detailed letters on an almost daily basis. Rudolf and Cameron wandered all over the island, schlepping microscopes, lab equipment, and specimen jars. After Rudolf sketched the plants, sometimes dissecting them on site, Cameron would pickle them in the white rum of the island and send them off to Harvard to study. Harvard also lent them in a camera to aid them on their expedition, but Rudolf refused to learn, preferring to draw. They go back to the US, where they start their trans-American journey on a train from Massachusetts to Chicago to Missouri, through the endless grassy plains of Kansas, and then they travel through the Rockies down to New Mexico and Arizona, where they caught a super bloom and an absurd number of cacti, and then they crossed the desert and landed in San Diego. Next, they headed up to San Francisco, and Rudolf engages in the Battle of the Bay 1892 edition, declaring they'll stay in Oakland because San Francisco is too noisy. Rudolf reports that the California poppies were so common and grow so thickly that the mountains glow orange. After time in the Bay, they travel eastward through Colorado Springs to St. Louis, where Rudolf complains that the water is so filthy he wouldn't keep a frog in it. At this point, Rudolf is pretty homesick. He's collected hundreds of specimens and drawn over 350 plants. So he returns home with all of his specimens, seeds, and drawings. Rudolf and Leopold have enough material for the next 3 years of work. They have incredibly prolific years, making flowers and magnified cellular models that they regularly ship back to Harvard. This field trip proved to be so successful that in 1895, Rudolf embarks on a second US tour. As he travels from stop to stop, he's unaware that his father Leopold had a stroke and passed away. It takes 2 weeks for the news to catch up to him, at which point he cancels the rest of the trip and returns home to Germany forever. Now it's just Rudolf. He throws himself into his work and spends time developing novel ways to innovate on the work he did with his father. Because of the time he spent fixing models at the museum, he becomes interested in making the models more vivid, stable, and durable. He reduces overpainting and starts exploring enamel work. This is the time when Rudolph makes some of the masterpieces of the glass flower collection, such as the iris, the maple, the apple blossoms, and the lotus. Towards the end of his life, Rudolph creates a series of glass fruits succumbing to different blights and in different stages of rot. And in 1939, after 50 years of working on the glass flower models, Rudolf Blaschke passed away. While he married, he never had any children, and the Blaschkes never took any apprentices. When people asked about the secret to the Blaschkes' astounding work, Leopold said it was in the hands, that each successive generation of glassmakers learned from and built on the skills of the last. In the end, instead of producing 50 models, the Blaschkes produced 4,300 models that represent 780 plant species. Mary Ware paid for everything, steadfastly supporting Leopold and Rudolph to the end of their lives. The flowers live on at Harvard, never wilting, delicate masterpieces that have delighted a century of students and museum goers alike. They rarely leave, and when they do, they travel by hearse because it has the best suspension on the market. So let's raise a glass to the arts that inform science and the science that informs art, to under-promising and over-delivering, and to paying artists and craftspeople a living wage because they'll produce wonders that endure beyond their lifetimes.